Are you ready for a 16-team college football playoff? What about the SEC getting 4 automatic bids to said playoff? Well, if you said no, you better brace because it's coming. We got an absolute bombshell in college football this last week with Ross Dellinger with Yahoo Sports putting out an article talking about the state of the college football playoff. And essentially, last spring, it was revealed that during heated negotiations, the Big Ten and SEC were given full discretion and full decision-making power over the future of the college football playoff. And they have a proposal for a new college football playoff model that was leaked for the first time by Ross Dellinger finally this last week. And that proposed college football playoff model includes expanding to a 14 or 16-team playoff, going from 12 to that number, and then having automatic qualifiers baked into that playoff. This would include 4 automatic bids for the SEC and the Big Ten as the 2 best conferences in college football. This would include 2 automatic bids, each for the Big 12 and ACC, and then 1 bid to share for all of the other group of 6 conferences. And then that would leave us with room for 1 to 3 at-large bids, depending on whether or not they go for the 14-team model or the 16-team model. Needless to say, this is a massive news. That would include a ton of massive changes, and among them are some changes to Conference Championship Week and just discussions about how the sport itself would change in this scenario. So in this video, we're going to talk about some of those. Let's start with Conference Championship Weekend, because part of this model and part of what the discussions have been like here is talking about fixing Conference Championship Weekend. The powers that be obviously were not very satisfied to be hearing head coaches like Rhett Lashley or Lane Kiffin talking about either not wanting to make their conference title game because of fear of what would happen if they lose, or in Rhett Lashley's case, talking about potentially just not playing in the conference championship game and having that be to their benefit because it would guarantee them a playoff spot versus putting something on the line and risking it when other teams weren't having to do that, like Alabama this last season. So in order to fix Conference Championship Weekend in this model where the SEC and Big Ten each get 4 bids and the Big 12 and ACC each get 2 bids, this is the proposal to fix that. Basically, there would be automatic bids for the top 2 teams in the SEC and the Big Ten and an automatic bid for the top 1 team in the Big 12 and ACC. These teams would not participate in Conference Championship Weekend. Instead, they would be rewarded for finishing at or near the top of their conferences by getting an automatic spot in the playoffs. During Conference Championship Weekend, they would instead feature play-in games, which would be determined by the conference standings in each conference and would have those teams match up. In the SEC and Big Ten, it would be their 3rd place finisher versus their 6th place finisher, and then their 4th versus their 5th. The winners of those 2 games get spots into the college football playoff, and then in the case of the Big 12 and the ACC, it would be their 2nd and 3rd place finishers going head-to-head. So as you can see, if they did this model in this last season, the 2024 season, it would have been Tennessee versus Ole Miss, Alabama versus LSU, which would have been a rematch, Indiana versus Iowa, and then Ohio State versus Illinois in the Big Ten, which in my opinion, the Big Ten games looking a little bit more potentially lopsided than the SEC games in that case. And then in the Big 12, BYU versus Iowa State. BYU thought they were snubbed from the conference title game anyways, and then Miami versus Clemson being the last one over there in the ACC, giving the Hurricanes a chance to make it. So obviously this is a radical change, and it's a change that I think comes with some good and some not so good. So we'll talk about the pros and cons. We'll start with the good, which is I think this fixes the Conference Championship Week flaws. There's a lot of flaws right now where teams legitimately don't want to play. There's not really a ton of incentive. Yes, the first round bye is on the line, but you have the risk of potentially missing the playoffs altogether, which is a pretty dang big risk. And I know it didn't happen to SMU this last season, but feasibly it could happen to anyone. So it's something that did not make any sense. And in certain cases, you would rather be a team that does not finish in the top 2 of your conference and doesn't have to play in their conference title game and just gets a spot in the playoff instead of having to do that. This removes power from the committee. The committee no longer gets to decide who makes and misses the playoffs from the power conferences in this model. Instead, it's determined by their standings in the conference, which definitely has its trade-offs, but on the bright side, it removes power from a very flawed committee that people do not trust right now. And then it also serves as a bit of a college football playoff extension. We're getting 6 games that have no doubt in their value. It is a win and you are in the CFP, lose and you are most likely out of the CFP unless you are able to earn an at-large spot. So the consequences of these games are very clear, and it serves basically as an extension of the playoff, basically 6 more playoff games. But there's the flip side of that coin, which is the bad of this model. And I think the bad of this proposed model is really, really bad, and reason that this part of it is my least favorite part. It essentially would destroy the meaning of non-conference games, because if all that matters is finishing high in your conference standings to have a shot at the playoffs, you could potentially just lose all of your non-conference games. It doesn't matter as much. It really would reduce the stakes of those games, and we've had some really iconic ones over the years, so that would be tough. That would be a tough pill to swallow. I understand that this might also lead to teams scheduling tougher non-conference opponents, which is on the brighter side, but what's a better game if the game has way less stakes and way less hype around it? It kind of is just like a trade-off of where you end up with nothing. It's going to reduce the value of the regular season, which I think is the most sacred part of college football, the part that needs to be protected the most, and in this case this would not be protecting it, because the regular season, especially late in the season, if you're Oregon and you're in number one in the conference, obviously, yeah, you want to finish in the top 2, but it's not as big of a deal if you lose a couple games, because as long as you're still in the top 6, I guess a more extreme example would be like if Tennessee was third in the SEC and they had no chance of getting out of the top 2, maybe they cruise versus Vandy, maybe they cruise late in the season and don't have to start their starters or something like that. We could be in a situation and in a world where we're talking about meaningless regular season games, and that's frankly my worst nightmare as a college football fan. It's going to eliminate the fluidity that allowed college football to reward conferences for having good seasons. So in any given year, even if a group of 5 conference is having a great season and they have like 3 top 25 teams that are really good, they're only likely going to get 1 bid, and it erases a lot of the fluidity. The Big Ten and SEC, no matter how much of a down year they're having, they're always going to get 4 teams in. There's no fluidity for the season to adapt with how good the teams are in that given season, and that's something that I really think is going to be lost with this, and I'm really sad to think about that. And then finally, we're going to get a lot more neutral site games, most likely. We're going to reduce the value of games that are at home venues and then put the value on these games, which I would assume are going to be at a neutral site. I would love for these to be home games. I just could not see these conferences doing that. I would see them most likely having these games at a neutral site, which to me, just more neutral site games, more lifeless environments that aren't the essence of what we love about college football. And to me, that makes me a little bit sad as well. So it's a pretty extensive list of bad, and you can probably tell I'm not the biggest fan of this. Then, of course, there's the other thing to mention, which is what will the group of 5 do? If we're in this scenario, in this world where conference championship weekend looks like that for the powers that be, the group of 5, or I guess in this case the group of 6, because the Pac-12 is also lumped in, would have to figure out what to do with their conference championship weekend. Do they still have conference championship games where they're pitting their champion there and hoping to boost their resume enough to get them in at the risk of them going down? Like this last season, Boise State playing in their conference title game only serves to hurt the Mountain West. If they just don't play it, Boise State is going to guaranteed be the highest ranked group of 6 team. It's kind of going to be an interesting situation. You can clearly see the group of 5 not prioritized here. Still, even in a proposed 16 team model, only 1 group of 5 team getting a guaranteed spot in there. So clearly not being thought of, clearly being kicked aside. I'm not sure what I would do if I were them in this case, because you get put in a really difficult position where a conference title game loses a lot of its value, and if you're doing that, you're risking your top dogs at getting knocked out, and the power conferences aren't having to do that. Finally, we'll take a look at the actual 16-team playoff based on the proposal, based on that conference championship weekend. If we played that and all the favorites won those games, this is what the 16-team playoff would end up looking like. You can see the matchups in there with Miami making it in this scenario, Clemson being the 15 seed, even South Carolina getting in, Ole Miss getting in if they win that play-in game presumptively. There's a lot of interesting things that happen when you take a look at what would have happened if we had a 16-team playoff this last season. Obviously, still only 1 group of 5 team getting in Boise State at number 10. So it creates an interesting discussion. I still think it makes sense to have first-round home games here, and I hope they keep that because I think that's one of the few redeeming qualities that the college football playoff has. So hopefully first round home games, and then New Year's 6 games in the subsequent rounds is still doable in 16 because there's still 6 games there. The only one where you wouldn't have one would be the national semifinal, which they would have to figure out essentially. But Or I suppose that's actually not even true. Ignore me, because that's the national championship game. I just formatted it weird. But anyways, that is the proposal that is on the table. It would drastically change the sport, and honestly, I think it's building towards something far bigger than that, which will include eventually the SEC and Big Ten breaking away and creating their own league. I think this is just another step towards that. This currently, those two conferences just abusing their power and trying to keep things relatively intact while there's other value in those other conferences. But let me know down in the comments, what do you think about this proposal? What do you think about a 16-team playoff? What do you think about a reimagined conference championship weekend? I'm interested to hear your guys' thoughts down in the comments below. And that's all I got for you guys in this video, so I will see you guys later this week.